The guns thunder across the water. Smoke obscures the morning sun. Through the acrid haze, Rear Admiral Charles Watson stands on the quarterdeck of HMS Cumberland, watching the ancient fortress disintegrate under British fire. It is the 13th of February, 1756. Before him, the most formidable pirate stronghold in the Indian Ocean, Vijaydurg, known to the British as Gheriah, burns. Within the fortress walls, 250 cannons fall silent. A fleet of Maratha warships grabs, gallivats, and captured merchantmen erupts in flames, the fire spreading from hull to hull until the entire harbor becomes an inferno. 30 years of Angre family power, 30 years of defiance against 3 European empires, ends in a single day's bombardment. Yet this morning's victory represents far more than the destruction of one pirate base. Watson does not yet know it, but he has just eliminated the last significant obstacle to British naval supremacy in the Arabian Sea. 5 months from now, he will stand beside Robert Clive at Plassey, beginning the conquest of Bengal. The fall of Gheriah marks not merely the end of the Angre dynasty, but the beginning of Britain's unchallenged domination of the Indian Ocean, a supremacy that will endure for nearly 2 centuries. The paradox is striking. Admiral Watson commanded one of the most strategically consequential naval actions of the 18th century, yet his name remains virtually unknown. The campaign combined Royal Navy professionalism with company ruthlessness, European firepower with Indian political intrigue. It demonstrated amphibious warfare techniques that would become standard British practice. It secured the Western approaches to India at precisely the moment Britain needed them. Secured. And yet, history has almost entirely forgotten it. Overshadowed by Plassey, ignored in favor of more glamorous conquests, the capture of Gheriah vanished from popular memory almost as soon as the smoke cleared. Even specialist military historians struggle to reconstruct the battle's details from fragmentary records and contradictory accounts. This is the story of how a relatively obscure naval officer and a handful of king's ships destroyed the most powerful indigenous maritime force in India. It is the story of the Angre family admirals, pirates or patriots, depending on one's perspective, whose naval genius terrorized European trade for half a century. It is the story of how imperial ambition, commercial greed, and technological superiority converged on a single fortress, changing the balance of power in the Indian Ocean forever. Watson's squadron approached, Gheriah not knowing whether they would succeed or join the long list of failed expeditions. What they achieved that February morning determined the future of British India. This is how the pirate fortress fell. To understand why Gheriah mattered, one must first understand the Angre. Their story begins not with piracy but with patriotism, or at least with Maratha naval ambition, in an age when European powers sought to monopolize Indian Ocean trade. Tulaji Angre, born in 1669, became Sarkel Grand Admiral of the Maratha Navy in 1698. At that time, the Konkan coast, that lush but rugged strip between the Western Ghats and the Arabian Sea, resembled less a unified territory than a maritime frontier contested by multiple powers. The Portuguese held Goa and several smaller enclaves. The British East India Company controlled Bombay. The Dutch maintained trading posts. The city admirals of Janjira, African-origin Muslims in Mughal service, commanded their own formidable fleet. The Marathas, despite Shivaji's earlier successes, remained primarily a land power. Kanhoji changed that calculation entirely. A contemporary English report from 1725 described him with grudging admiration as possessing uncommon talents for naval warfare, together with personal courage and a capacity for command that few European officers could equal. He understood what the expanding Maratha state required, not merely coastal defenses, but an aggressive naval force capable of challenging European maritime dominance. His strategy proved remarkably sophisticated for its time. Rather than engaging superior European ships in open-water battles, Kanhoji exploited the Konkan's complex geography, its countless creeks, hidden coves, and narrow channels where larger European vessels could not maneuver effectively. He fortified virtually every natural harbor between Mumbai and Goa with citadels, batteries, and dockyards. Vijaydurg, his capital, became the centerpiece of this defensive network. The fortress's position made it nearly impregnable. Built on a peninsula where the Vijaydurg River met the Arabian Sea, Gheriah enjoyed protection on three sides by water, with the landward approach defended by triple walls and a deep ditch. Contemporary descriptions emphasize its strength. A British surveyor wrote in 1738 that Gheriah is extremely well fortified both by art and nature. The isthmus, which joins it to the mainland, scarce admits of 3 men abreast and is commanded by batteries disposed with great judgment. From this stronghold, Kanhoji launched a campaign that terrorized European shipping for 3 decades. His methods, viewed from London or Lisbon as outright piracy, looked rather different from a Maratha perspective. He claimed the right to tax all vessels passing through waters. His sovereign controlled precisely the same principle by which European powers claimed navigation rights elsewhere. Ships refusing to purchase his Kartaz naval pass faced seizure. Crews became hostages. Cargoes disappeared into Gheriah's warehouses. The toll on European commerce proved substantial. Between 1705 and 1729, Angre vessels captured or destroyed over 300 European ships, including multiple East Indiamen of considerable value. The Honorable East India Company calculated its annual losses from Angre depredations at ₹500,000, a fortune in early 18th century terms. Portuguese merchants complained bitterly to Lisbon. Dutch factors at Surat petitioned their superiors for naval protection. Yet every European attempt to suppress Kanhoji failed spectacularly. In 1712, a joint Anglo-Maratha expedition against Gheriah withdrew after suffering heavy casualties from the fortress guns. In 1717, the Portuguese attacked with a fleet of 30 vessels, only to be repulsed with considerable loss. A 1720 combined Portuguese-British assault achieved nothing except demonstrating Gheriah's impregnability. Kanhoji died peacefully in his fortress on the 4th of July, 1729, having never suffered a significant defeat at European hands. His sons proved less capable of maintaining family unity. Succession disputes fractured the Angre domain into a competing spheres. Sambhaji, the eldest, inherited Gheriah and the southern territories. Manaji controlled the northern ports around Kolaba. When Sambhaji died in 1742, his brother Tulaji succeeded to Gheriah and the title of Sarkil. Tulaji Angre possessed abilities that contemporary observers considered superior, even to his famous fathers. A British intelligence assessment from 1753 noted that Tulaji exhibits greater seamanship and tactical skill than Kanhoji, together with a more ruthless disposition. His captures included some of the most valuable prizes taken from European powers in that era: the Charlotte of Madras, the Derby, the Restoration, several Dutch vessels, and numerous Portuguese merchantmen. By 1749, his ships operated with impunity from Kutch to Cochin, a coastal range of more than 800 miles. But Tulaji made a fatal error. He challenged not merely European commercial interests, but the authority of the Peshwa Balaji Baji Rao, effective ruler of the Maratha Empire. The relationship deteriorated rapidly. Tulaji refused to pay customary tribute to Pune. He raided territories under direct Peshwa administration. In a particularly spectacular demonstration of defiance, he mutilated Maratha revenue collectors sent to demand payment, according to British sources, slitting their noses before sending them back empty-handed. For Balaji Baji Rao, this insubordination could not stand. Yet, the Peshwa lacked the naval strength to reduce Gheriah alone. He required European assistance, specifically British assistance, and Britain, by 1755, possessed both the means and the motive to oblige him. The means arrived in the person of Commodore William James, commander of the Bombay Marine. James, a Welshman of humble origins who had risen through sheer ability and determination, understood the Konkan's waters intimately. In April 1755, he launched an attack on Vijaydurg, Tulaji's northern stronghold. After intensive bombardment that expended 800 rounds and shells, James breached the eastern face and forced the garrison's surrender. Contemporary accounts describe this as the first successful European assault on an Angre fortress. That autumn, the Peshwa's agents approached Richard Bourchier, governor of Bombay, with a proposition, a joint expedition against Gheriah, with the Royal Navy providing sea power whilst Maratha land forces invested the fortress from the rear. In exchange, Britain would receive a substantial share of whatever booty Gheriah contained, rumored to be immense, plus elimination of the most persistent threat to company shipping. The proposal reached London, received swift approval, and in November 1755, Rear Admiral Charles Watson, commanding the East Indies Station, received orders to proceed to Bombay and organize the campaign. Watson had been serving in Indian waters since 1754, having previously distinguished himself at the battles of Cape Finisterre. He possessed the operational experience, the temperament, and crucially the ships required for the task. With him came Lieutenant Colonel Robert Clive, fresh from his triumph at Arcot but not yet the legendary conqueror of Plassey. Clive commanded 500 European soldiers and a contingent of Topaz's Indo-Portuguese soldiers trained in European tactics. This small but professional force would prove decisive. By January 1756, the pieces aligned. Watson's squadron lay at Bombay. Commodore James stood ready with the Bombay Marine. The Peshwa's land forces moved into position around Gheriah's landward approaches. Tulaji Angre, isolated and defiant in his fortress, prepared to face the most formidable combined force yet assembled against the Angre dominion. The stage was set for the destruction of the pirate stronghold. Admiral Watson's squadron weighed anchor from Bombay on the 2nd of February, 1756. The force comprised 4 ships of the Royal Navy HMS Cumberland, 66 guns, flying Watson's flag, HMS Kent, 64 guns, under Rear Admiral George Pocock, HMS Tiger, 60 guns, and HMS Salisbury, 50 guns, plus HMS Bridgewater, a 24-gun, 6th rate, leading the line. Commodore James accompanied them with 3 vessels of the Bombay Marine, Protector, Revenge, and the Grab Bombay. 2 bomb vessels completed the squadron, bringing its total complement to 11 warships, mounting approximately 450 guns. The fleet proceeded southward along the Konkan coast, arriving off Gheriah on the 12th of February. What Watson saw through his telescope must have impressed even a veteran of Cape Finisterre. The fortress dominated a triangular peninsula, its massive laterite walls rising nearly 20 meters above the waterline. 27 bastions studded the perimeter, each mounting multiple cannon. The eastern face, protected by triple walls and a flooded ditch, appeared impregnable to land assault. The harbor bristled with masts, tulajis, fleet of grabs, galavats, and captured prizes. Perhaps 200 vessels of various sizes lay crowded together in the anchorage. Intelligence reports indicated a garrison of 2,000 men and 250 guns. The fortress magazines, according to deserters, held sufficient powder and shot to sustain a prolonged siege. Within the walls lived not only Tulaji's soldiers but his entire family, plus numerous European prisoners, Dutch and British sailors captured from merchantmen over previous years. Watson sent forward a boat under flag of truce, demanding immediate surrender. The reply came not in words but in cannon fire. Tulaji Angre, whatever his ultimate fate, would not yield without a fight. The admiral spent the 12th positioning his ships. Naval gunfire, he understood, must focus on two objectives. First, silencing the fortress batteries to allow Clive's landing. Second, destroying Angre's fleet before it could escape or reinforce the garrison. The squadron formed line of battle, with the bomb vessels positioned eastward to lob shells over the walls into the fortress interior. At dawn, on the 13th of February, the bombardment commenced. Contemporary accounts describe a fury of fire that astonished even experienced naval observers. The ships engaged at close range, scarcely 100 yards, pouring shot into Gheriah's defenses. The fortress replied vigorously, its gunners demonstrating the skill that had repulsed previous European attempts. Round shot crashed through rigging, shattered timbers, and sent splinters scything across British decks. The noise, according to one participant, exceeded anything heard in European warfare. The constant roar of 400 guns creating a din that prevented all verbal communication. Yet, European gunnery discipline proved superior. Watson's gun crews, trained to the precise standards of the Royal Navy, maintained a rate of fire that Gheriah's defenders could not match. Systematically, the British ships worked along the fortress perimeter, dismounting batteries, breaching ramparts, and pulverizing defensive positions. The bomb vessels, meanwhile, arced shells over the walls with devastating effect. One shell, falling amongst Angre's fleet, ignited a vessel whose fire spread rapidly to neighboring craft. This conflagration decided the battle. Within minutes, dozens of ships blazed. Crews abandoned their vessels and fled ashore. Flames leapt from hull to hull, consuming grabs, gallivats, and captured prizes alike. The fire reached a magazine aboard one of the larger vessels, triggering an explosion that sent burning debris cascading across the harbor. Contemporary paintings show the anchorage transformed into an inferno, thick smoke obscuring the fortress walls. By mid-morning, Gheriah's guns had largely fallen silent. Watson signaled Clive to commence the landing operation. In the night of the 12th to 13th of February, the troops had already been positioned aboard boats. Now, under cover of continued naval bombardment, they pulled for the shore. Clive selected a landing point on the peninsula's northern face, away from the heaviest defenses. The boats grounded on a narrow beach. European soldiers and topazes splashed ashore, formed up under fire, and advanced towards the walls. Resistance proved lighter than anticipated. The naval bombardment had demoralized the garrison, and many defenders had already fled toward the landward gates, seeking escape from the flames consuming their ships. Clive's force stormed a breach on the eastern face, meeting brief hand-to-hand resistance before the remaining defenders broke. By afternoon, British soldiers controlled the main gate and were methodically clearing the fortress interior. Tulaji Angre himself had already departed, slipping out during the bombardment to seek terms with the Peshwa's forces investing the landward approaches. That decision proved catastrophic. Rather than receiving negotiation, Tulaji found himself promptly arrested on the Peshwa's orders and sent inland under guard, beginning a captivity that would last 30 years until his death in Solapur prison in 1786. With the fall of Gheriah and Tulaji's capture, the resistance collapsed entirely. The garrison surrendered on the 14th of February. British and company forces began cataloging their prize. The booty proved spectacular. Official records listed 250 guns captured, ranging from light swivel cannon to heavy siege pieces. Magazines held vast quantities of powder and shot. Warehouses contained spices, textiles, and trade goods valued at over 100,000 rupees. Additional valuables, plate, coin, and personal effects brought the total to approximately 130,000 pounds sterling, an immense fortune by 18th century standards. Equally valuable, from the company's perspective, were the European prisoners liberated from Gheriah's dungeons, dozens of British and Dutch sailors, some held for years, blinking in the sunlight as they emerged from captivity. Their testimony would fuel propaganda depicting the Angres as barbarous pirates rather than what they actually were, admirals defending Maratha maritime sovereignty. British casualties remained remarkably light. Watson's dispatches reported no ships lost, minimal damage to the squadron, and fewer than a dozen killed amongst the landing force. Angre casualties ran considerably higher. Contemporary estimates suggested 500 dead or wounded, though precise figures remain uncertain. The fall of Gheriah resonated immediately across the Indian Ocean. In London, news of the victory reached the Admiralty in May, generating brief celebration before being overshadowed by developments in Europe, where the 7 Years' War had commenced. In Bombay, merchants exhaled with relief the Angre threat, which had plagued their trade for half a century, had finally been eliminated. In Pune, the Peshwa moved quickly to garrison the fortress with his own troops, incorporating Angre territories into direct Maratha administration. And in Bengal, just months away, Watson and Clive would collaborate again, this time not against pirates but against the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The expertise in combined operations developed at Gheriah coordination between naval bombardment and land assault, exploitation of European firepower superiority, ruthless exploitation of indigenous political divisions would serve them well at Chandanagar and Plassey. The capture of Gheriah marked the last significant naval obstacle to British supremacy in the Arabian Sea. From February 1756 forward, the company's ships sailed the western Indian coast without fear of indigenous challenge. The Maratha Navy, once a formidable force, declined rapidly in the absence of Angre leadership. Within 2 decades, it would cease to exist as an effective fighting force. A 30-year reign of maritime power had ended in 2 days of bombardment. The most formidable indigenous naval commander in Indian history languished in a Maratha prison. The fortress that had defied 3 European powers lay under British-backed Maratha control. The Arabian Sea, for the first time in half a century, became safe for European commerce. Yet the manner of Gheriah's fall troubled thoughtful observers even then. The campaign succeeded not through British superiority alone, but through exploiting Maratha internal divisions. Tulaji fell because the Peshwa preferred European partnership to naval independence. The victory demonstrated not European invincibility, but European opportunism and Indian political fragmentation. Those lessons would echo through the next century of imperial expansion. Admiral Charles Watson did not long survive his triumph at Gheriah. 15 months after the fortress fell, on the 16th of August, 1757, he died in Calcutta of fever, aged just 43. His body lies in St. John's Churchyard, beneath a monument that describes him as a gallant officer whose services to his country in the East Indies were of the highest importance. Yet, the monument stands unvisited, ignored by tourists who flock to Plassey's commemorations. Watson's name appears in no popular histories. His achievement at Gheriah receives scarcely a footnote in accounts of British India. This amnesia seems almost deliberate. In the immediate aftermath, the capture of Gheriah generated considerable excitement in company circles. The court of directors in London voted substantial prize money to Watson and his officers. Contemporary newspapers celebrated the destruction of the pirate stronghold that had long infested the Malabar coast. An engraving by Dominic Serres, painted in 1771, depicted the bombardment in dramatic detail, showing Watson's flagship amidst the smoke and flames. Yet within a generation, Gheriah had been largely forgotten. Several factors explain this disappearance from historical consciousness. First and foremost, Plassey. The Battle of Plassey, fought just 4 months after Gheriah's fall, transformed Britain's position in India far more dramatically than any naval victory could. Where Gheriah eliminated a maritime nuisance, Plassey delivered Bengal's resources that would finance Britain's subsequent conquests across the subcontinent. Clive became famous. Watson, dying within the year, became a footnote. Second, the campaign's nature proved difficult to glorify. Unlike Plassey, where Clive's tiny force ostensibly defeated overwhelming odds through British courage and Indian treachery, the standard 19th century narrative, Gheriah fell to overwhelming European firepower applied against an isolated opponent. There was little heroism in destroying a fortress, with 400 guns when the defenders possessed no means of reply. The Angre fleet burned not through tactical brilliance, but through fortunate shell placement. The landing succeeded because the bombardment had already broken the garrison's morale. Third, imperial propaganda preferred clear narratives of British superiority over acknowledgement of Indian military competence. The Angres, to be diminished, had to be recast as mere pirates, criminals, not admirals. Lauding the campaign's difficulty would grant them legitimacy. Better to forget Gheriah entirely than to explain why it required the Royal Navy's East Indies Squadron to accomplish what 3 European powers had failed to achieve over 30 years. Fourth, the expedition's reliance on Maratha cooperation sat uncomfortably with later imperial mythology. Victorian historians, writing after the Anglo-Maratha Wars, when Britain ruled India directly, preferred narratives of British conquest over accounts of partnership with indigenous powers. That Watson succeeded by allying with the Peshwa against Tulaji complicated the story of inevitable European triumph over Asian weakness. Yet the campaign's strategic consequences proved profound and lasting, even if unremembered. Most immediately, Gheriah's fall secured the company's western maritime frontier at precisely the moment that frontier became critical. Bengal's conquest required safe sea communications between Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. The wealth flowing from Bengal needed protected shipping routes to London. Had the Angres survived another decade, British consolidation of eastern India would have faced continual harassment of its supply lines. Gheriah's capture came just in time. The battle also pioneered tactics that became standard British practice in colonial warfare. The combination of naval bombardment, amphibious landing, and exploitation of indigenous political divisions would be replicated countless times across the next century, at Alexandria, at Canton, at Rangoon, on the Yangtze, along the Zulu coast. Watson and Clive, perhaps unwittingly, established the template for Victorian gunboat diplomacy. More broadly, Gheriah's fall marked the end of effective indigenous naval resistance to European maritime dominance in the Indian Ocean. The Angres represented the last indigenous power capable of seriously challenging European shipping. After 1756, no Asian force in the region possessed the shipbuilding capacity, gunnery expertise, or strategic position to threaten European merchant fleets. The Indian Ocean became a European lake, remaining so until the 20th century. This Maritime supremacy enabled everything that followed in British India. Internal conquest depended on external security. The company could campaign in Bengal, the Deccan, and eventually the Punjab, precisely because its sea communications remained uncontested. Had the Angre survived, or had another indigenous naval power arisen, British expansion might have stalled at the coasts, unable to project power inland whilst defending vulnerable supply lines. Modern military analysts recognize Gheriah's significance. A recent study by the Indian Naval Historical Research Center notes that the destruction of Vijaydurg marked the definitive establishment of European maritime hegemony in South Asian waters, with consequences for indigenous naval development that persisted into the 20th century. The Indian Navy names its shore establishment INS Angre in honor of the dynasty, acknowledging their role as defenders of Indian maritime sovereignty against foreign dominance. Yet broader recognition remains elusive. British military history celebrates Plassey, Assaye, Seringapatam, and countless land victories, whilst ignoring the naval actions that made those victories possible. Watson's name appears in specialist naval histories, but the general reader encounters him never. Gheriah merits at most a paragraph in comprehensive accounts of the 7 Years' War. This forgetting carries consequences. It perpetuates myths of British land power superiority whilst obscuring the maritime dominance that actually enabled imperial expansion. It erases indigenous naval competence from historical consciousness, rendering the Angres as mere pirates rather than skilled admirals defending their sovereign's interests. It obscures the extent to which British success depended on exploiting Indian political divisions rather than European military superiority alone. The forgotten quality of Gheriah extends even to physical commemoration. Vijaydurg Fort still stands on the Konkan coast, its massive walls testament to Maratha engineering. But no plaque marks the British assault. No monument commemorates Watson's achievement. The fort receives occasional tourists, mostly Indian visitors interested in Shivaji's history, few of whom know it once hosted the most formidable challenge to European maritime power in South Asia. Watson himself rests under a neglected monument in Calcutta, his name weathered, his achievements unremembered by the city's inhabitants. No street bears his name. No ship perpetuates his memory. The Royal Navy, which decorated him in life, forgot him in death. Perhaps this forgetting is itself revealing. Gheriah's capture demonstrated that British imperial success depended less on inherent superiority than on temporary technological advantages, political opportunism, and indigenous collaboration. Those realities sat uncomfortably with imperial mythology then, and perhaps with post-imperial sensibilities now. On the 2nd of February, 2025, Vijaydurg Fort stood much as it did on that same date 269 years earlier, when Watson's squadron arrived. The massive laterite walls, weathered by monsoons but structurally intact, still dominate the peninsula. Local fishermen moor their boats in the harbor, where Tulaji's fleet once anchored. Tourists, mostly Indian, climb the ramparts to photograph the Arabian Sea, rarely knowing they stand where 250 guns once thundered defiance at 3 European empires. The fort's silence speaks volumes. No naval force operates from Gheriah now. The Maratha navy vanished entirely within decades of the Angre's fall, its decline hastening the British consolidation of coastal India. By the late 19th century, indigenous shipbuilding traditions had atrophied so completely that Indian maritime historians speak of a dark age of naval capability lasting until independence. Tulaji Angre spent his final 30 years imprisoned in various Maratha forts, dying in Solapur in 1786, aged approximately 65. No contemporary source records his final words or thoughts. His descendants, stripped of power and wealth, vanished into obscurity. The Angre name survives in the Konkan region, borne by families who may or may not descend from the admiral's line. But the naval dynasty ended completely with Tulaji's capture. Admiral Charles Watson fared little better in posthumous recognition. His monument in Calcutta's St. John's Churchyard describes his gallant services, but few visitors pause there. British naval history, voluminous though it be, dedicates more words to minor skirmishes in European waters than to Watson's systematic destruction of the most significant indigenous naval power in South Asia. The definitive history of the East Indies Station, published in 1935, devotes 3 paragraphs to Gheriah. Robert Clive, by contrast, achieved immortality, though of an increasingly controversial sort. His fame rests on Plassey, yet his experience at Gheriah proved crucial to that later triumph. The combined operations lessons learned bombarding Vijaydurg translated directly to the capture of Chandanagar 4 months later. The ruthlessness demonstrated in treating with Tulaji's defenders presaged the cold calculation with which he would exploit Mir Jafar's treachery at Plassey. The wider consequences of Gheriah's fall took decades to fully manifest. British maritime supremacy in the Arabian Sea enabled the company to control not merely the coasts, but the hinterland, since internal conquest required secure supply lines from the sea. The Maratha Confederacy, deprived of naval strength, could not contest British consolidation of Bengal, nor could it effectively resist later British expansion westward. By 1818, when the Third Anglo-Maratha War ended Maratha independence entirely, the consequences of decisions made in 1756 had worked themselves out completely. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes what contemporary observers either ignored or deliberately obscured. That indigenous resistance to European imperial expansion proved far more formidable than Victorian. Triumphalism acknowledged. The Angres controlled the Konkan coast for half a century, not through primitive tactics but through sophisticated naval strategy adapted to local conditions. They understood combined operations, strategic positioning, and economic warfare. They built fortresses that withstood European siegecraft. They commanded fleets that captured hundreds of European vessels. That such capability existed, and that its elimination required the Royal Navy's East Indies Squadron, operating in alliance with the Maratha Empire's largest land power, reveals much about the actual balance of power in 18th century South Asia. British victory at Gheriah stemmed less from inherent superiority than from political opportunism, technological advantage in specific domains, naval gunnery, and the systematic exploitation of indigenous divisions. These truths, uncomfortable for imperial mythology, explain why Gheriah vanished from popular historical consciousness, even as Plassey became legendary. A victory achieved through overwhelming firepower against an isolated opponent, dependent on indigenous collaboration, demonstrating that European success required Asian political fragmentation. Such a narrative could not serve imperial propaganda. Yet, for serious students of military history, Gheriah merits careful attention. It demonstrated naval power's crucial role in imperial expansion. It pioneered combined operations tactics that became standard British practice. It illustrated how technological advantages in specific domains, naval gunnery, could overcome numerical and positional disadvantages. And it showed, perhaps most significantly, that indigenous military competence often equaled or exceeded European capabilities, and that European victory typically required not merely force but fortune, political opportunism, and local collaboration. Watson's forgotten triumph thus offers lessons beyond its immediate strategic consequences. It reminds us that history, as recorded, reflects political concerns as much as factual reality. It demonstrates how uncomfortable truths get written out of triumphalist narratives, and it suggests that careful examination of forgotten victories reveals more about imperial realities than celebratory accounts of famous battles. The guns of Gheriah fell silent on the 13th of February, 1756. Their echo, though faint, still resonates. The victory that secured Britain's maritime supremacy in South Asian waters deserves remembrance, even perhaps especially because that remembrance complicates simpler narratives of imperial inevitability. On the Konkan coast, waves still break against Vijaydurg's ancient walls. Within those walls, local guides tell visitors stories of Shivaji and Maratha glory, sometimes mentioning Tulaji Angre. Rarely do they mention Tulaji, or Watson, or the February day when the pirate fortress fell and the Indian Ocean became a British sea. Perhaps that forgetting, too, tells a truth, that all empires and their victories eventually fade into silence, remembered only by specialists and visitors to weathered monuments. Watson's achievement at Gheriah, like Watson himself, returned to the obscurity from which historical accident briefly lifted it. The fortress stands. The sea remains. The admirals in their battles have passed into that realm where forgotten heroes dwell, awaiting historians willing to resurrect them from undeserved obscurity. This, then, is the story history forgot, how a Welsh admiral and an English colonel, commanding the Royal Navy's East Indies Squadron in alliance with a Maratha Peshwa, seeking to discipline a rebellious subordinate, destroyed the most formidable indigenous naval power in the Indian Ocean, secured Britain's maritime supremacy in South Asian waters, and laid the foundation for imperial expansion that would endure 2 centuries. It deserves to be remembered.